Hello, everyone. So we are live now at the INIL webinar. My name is Ines Bulic Kojokariu. I'm the Deputy Director at the European Network on Independent Living. Thank you to everyone for joining. Today's webinar is a part of our 2 days of events. Yesterday we had our online members meeting, and today we are continuing with this webinar, which is on the topic of how can we ensure independent living for all, catering for people with diverse impairments. We decided to organize this webinar based on the survey we did among our members about what topic they would like to hear about most. We are very happy to have with us a number of speakers. I will present them all in 1 minute. Just as a way of introduction, to explain a little bit more about the topic. So INIL is a cross-disability organization. I don't know if all of you know that. We advocate for independent living for all, regardless of their impairment, regardless of the level of their support needs. We believe that everybody has a right to live independently in the community, and that is also what Article 19 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities says. People with disabilities, or as we say, disabled people, according to the convention, include all those who have a long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Disabled people are not a homogeneous group. They're very different people with different impairments, but also with different personal characteristics, with different backgrounds. Still, what they have in common is their right to live independently in the community. General Comment 5 on Article 19 further specifies that governments must enable everyone, regardless of the level of their support needs, to live in the community. People will need a wide range of support services, reasonable accommodations, etc., to remove the various barriers in the community that prevent them from participating on an equal basis with others. Today, during this webinars, we will speak to people with different impairments, different experiences, who will share with us what independent living means to them and what they need governments, others to do to make sure that they can live independently in the community, what kind of barriers they encounter in their everyday lives. In a way to help us really discuss and understand what challenges remain in our societies in different countries, and where we can work better together on tackling these from our point of view as obviously an NGO. So I very much forward to hearing from the different speakers. Simone just joined us. Hello, Simone. Simone, I will turn your camera off for the moment, if that is okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because we have a sign language interpreter with us, whom you can see here, Lisa. So we want to make sure that whoever needs sign language interpretation can see her well. Just before I introduce the speakers, a couple of...
Can I just ask? Sorry, can I just ask whether I can go on last just because I've had a lot of fluffle getting in?
No problem, Simone.
When I can give my
No problem, Simone. That's fine. Before I get to the speakers, just a couple of technical details. So we are We are recording this webinar just to make sure that whoever would like to see it afterwards, who's missed it today, can see it. If you would like to ask a question during the webinar, you have three options. Two options. You have the question and answer box, or you have the chat box. And I have two colleagues with me, Frank and Camille, who will help me follow your questions and to make sure we can get to them after the speakers. And one more thing, if you need captions, if you are using captions, there are two options again. You can either click on the closed caption button on your Zoom in the bottom part, or in your chat box, there is a link for captions, which you can put in your browsers. This way you can follow the captions live, whereas in Zoom there is a tiny delay in the captions. So whichever option you prefer, go for that. I think that is all in terms of the technical bits. So without further delay, I will just quickly go through the speakers at today's webinar. And each speaker was given a question in advance to think about, and I will repeat it, of course, today. So each speaker will get a question. We will go through all the speakers one by one. They will share their experiences, answer the questions, and then we will have the discussion. So we will start with Magnus Anden and Cecilia Blanck. They're both from Sweden, from the YAG Association. We will then continue with Thibault Corneloup, I probably mispronounced that, from France, from Autistes. We will then go on to Kristina Dūdonytė from Lithuania, from the Independent Living Association. Then on to Jolijn Santegoeds from the Netherlands. Sorry, Jolijn, I completely probably mispronounced that as well. Jolijn is from the European Network of Ex-Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. We will continue with Wheatley from the UK. He's from the European Union of the Deaf. On to Suvad Zahirović from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Suvad is from the Information Center for Persons with Disability, Lotos. And finally, we will end with Simone Aspis from the UK. Simone is from the Alliance for Inclusive Education, but also from the Free Our People campaign.
Can I just be really clear? Because
yes, absolutely.
I am only talking on behalf of Free Our People campaign and Through Changing Perspectives. I just want to keep making that clear. That's who I represent, not Alfie today.
Thank you, Simone. So Simone here is today for the Free Our People campaign. I've just read out the speakers' names, but I would just ask all the speakers to maybe tell us a couple of words about themselves before they start speaking. So finally, let's start with our first speaker, that is Magnus Anden and Cecilia Blanck from Sweden. Can I ask you to switch your camera on, Magnus and Cecilia? Hi there. So the question, first of all, I would like all speakers to reply to is, what does independent living mean to you, and what are the biggest challenges you face in order to enjoy that right? So over to you, Magnus and Cecilia. I will switch my camera off for a second. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ines. I hope you hear us now. So you, Magnus, you are the chairman of the Swedish organization YAG, and I am your sister, but I am also your legal representative, and I help you to express your wishes and needs in different situations. And now we have discussed this presentation together, and I will help you to read or tell the audience what we have agreed to together. Yeah. And since you, Magnus, you don't speak English, so you won't, as usual, you used to point with your finger when you agree with what I say. Jag berättar att du brukar peka med fingret när du håller med om vad jag säger. But I guess that Magnus will find this a little bit less interesting than when we speak in Swedish, but he knows it's important and we are agreed to the things we are going to say. So when it comes to independent living, to you, Magnus, it means the right to personal assistance 24/7. It means to be able to live in an ordinary flat, to live independently in society. And this, we are now in your flat, in your living room, in your own apartment. To you, it means not being forced into an institution of any kind. It's living like others do in Sweden. And it also means going to your work at JAG's office several days in week, except for now during the COVID-19 period here. And personal assistance is given wherever the user is. So therefore, it also means that you are able to spend some weeks every summer in our summer house and use your assistance there. Or during the cold Swedish winter, which is problematic to you sometimes, you can travel to Spain for a couple of weeks on vacation and breathe some warm air. We also have some challenges, of course, in this field. And one big challenge is what we call IQ discrimination. That people keep thinking that human value lies in intellectual capacity or in the ability to express yourself in ways that anyone can understand. This kind of discrimination takes place in different shapes. When someone with power expresses the opinion that people who cannot supervise their own assistants shouldn't be entitled to personal assistance and instead live in institutions. Or when the right to life is questioned, as this spring when COVID-19 put pressure on the medical care organizations, hospitals made up priority systems upon abilities to function both physically but also intellectually. And when researchers in the field of disability only interview people who can express themselves and that let them represent the whole population of persons with disabilities, because it's more practical and it is methodologically difficult to use a relative or representative as an informant. Or when you and your friends are not welcome in otherwise open activities because, as they say, you cannot take instructions and need practical support. Another big challenge is that the government in Sweden, during 10 years or more, wanted to save money. They have made cuts both in the right to personal assistance and the value of the assistance allowance. You, Magnus, you have kept the right to your hours of assistance, so you can still use personal assistance 24/7. But the right has been very much weakened through case law, judgments from Supreme Court, and how they are interpreted by the authorities. So you, Magnus, you have several friends who lost parts of their amounts of hours and then had to give up their free life and move to an institution. So it's very important to bear in mind that it's not the first hour of assistance that makes it possible to live independently. It's actually the last hour. You are affected, though, by the cuts in the assistance allowance. With a shrinking value of the money given from the state per hour, it's nowadays difficult to afford to recruit new assistants with skills and to provide education or formation. And you also need someone who supervises the assistants in a personalized way. The quality of the assistance is very important to you, Magnus. Your assistants have qualified tasks, and they also need to be able to work more independently than, for example, someone working with a user who can supervise him or herself. So that's some of our thoughts on this question. So we stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magnus and Cecilia. We will come back to you with the next question a bit later, but thank you for now. And I must apologize that we as ENEL cannot afford to have interpretation from different European languages as well. So unfortunately, so thank you very much for also translating for Magnus. But yes, we are glad to be able to involve you in any case. And yes, ideally, we would have had translation from other languages as well. But thank you for now. And let's move on to Thibault from Autistes. Hi, Thibault. So can you also answer this first initial question, please? And just to say, all the speakers have 5 minutes for this initial bit.
So I am Thibault, Autistes in an autistic play group in France. We defend disability rights in France and in independent living for all autistic people. And we try to build a community within a neurodiversity framework. So I am the co-founder and the communication officer today. For me, so independent living, I speak so for autistic people and our members. It doesn't mean independent because we are all interdependent, but I know it means that we can control our life and our support, and that we can take decisions about ourselves and our life. So for autistic people, it's more because I am going to talk later on about our needs, but our society is not fitted on our needs. Needs are fitted on neurotypical and able-bodied people for sure, but non-speaking autistic people, for instance, need specific communications tools or support to communicate. And I don't know, it's really a special need, it's more a different way of communication because every human can communicate, but it's different. And so I think in independent living, it will be good for us if there is a more suitable environment that includes all kinds of supports and hopefully for everybody. But about the big challenge, in France, I will speak for France because it's a major challenge for personal assistance or independent living. I think we are left behind. Many disability politics are basically based on institutions. It's a norm. And especially for intellectual disabled people, for autistic people, for mentally disabled people, they are destined for life in a institution. Education is poorly inclusive. There is a lack of community service, and we struggle for personal assistance. And for instance, it's 6 hours or 10 hours, but it's not enough for us to live in our own housing for some autistic people. And to illustrate the debates about independent livings, 2 months ago, a French deputy, left-wing deputy, wrote a report for the French parliament and told that he wants to remove a right to recruit, train, and manage personal assistance because he prefers charity or care worker And it justifies this measure because disabled people and elderly people are too vulnerable and debilitating to manage the assistance. So anyway, our politics don't consider we have a legal capacity, and legal capacity is not for autistic people, no speaking autistic people, and we cannot manage, so they consider that. And so it's the biggest challenge in France, I think. It's the legal capacity at first, and take our decision in our life and more service to enjoy it. That's good.
Thank you very much, Thibault, for this initial comment. So not a very good picture from France there. And Thibault will share a little bit more with us later. Let's move on to Kristina from Lithuania, from the Independent Living Association. Kristina, do you want to reflect on this initial question, please? Just don't forget to unmute yourself.
Hello, I'm Kristina. I'm board member of Independent Living Association in Lithuania, and also I'm a chairwoman of the commission that monitors the implementation of the rights of people with disabilities. So independent living means that all individuals with disabilities have the same right to choose and control their lives. Of course, the access to all other rights like transportation, education, employment, and all others all should be implemented. If talking about challenges in Lithuania or in my life, so now I don't face any of it because I have personal assistant, but of course still it is just a pilot project, and it maybe will end at the end of this year. So of course we need to have the act of it. So now Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor gave changes for our Social Integration Act, where personal assistant is included. But we as Commission, as I mentioned before, that monitors the implementation of the rights of people with disabilities, now give proposals for this changes that it should be related with Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So we hope that they will take a good decision for it, and if everything be okay, so this act should be entered into force next year. And if talking about other challenges, so I think the biggest is the institutions, because now, as I hear in all of the countries, also group homes are bolted, and anyone can stop it. That's all.
Oh, sorry, now I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Kristina, so for sharing that. Jolijn, would you like to come switch your video on now? Hi, Jolijn. So Jolijn is, as I said, from the European Network of Users and Survivors in Psychiatry, and yes, please share with us your thoughts on this initial question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm Jolijn Santegoeds. You pronounced it quite well. Independent living, I think for persons with psychosocial disabilities, it's on the one hand, we face a lot of institutionalization and forced treatments, which is of course the opposite of independent living, because we are subjected to group schemes and all these fixed routines in institutions that leave no choice. And then I personally had the experience that when I kind of escaped from the institution, and then I became homeless, and which is like there was an absolute lack of support because of having the diagnosis. So even in the regular shelter for homeless people, I was rejected because they said they were not equipped to deal with persons with psychosocial disabilities. When I wanted to go to education, they gave me the same argument, but I managed to convince them. But this is something that happens a lot, that in many social services are not accessible for people who have any kind of psychiatric diagnosis. They get excluded and stigmatized, and which leaves people in a kind of black hole without actual support, not for their basic needs and not for their additional support needs. And then the only thing left is often the institution, unless you have the so-called milder problems that can be dealt with by a single psychologist or something, then you may have some choices in where to go. But when you have more intense support needs, basically the only option is the hospital, because society is really rejective of persons who are so-called a danger to themselves or others, or who lack the insight of their own illness, and they refuse treatment. So then the laws allow forced treatment, and they strip you from legal capacity, they strip you from liberty, they strip you from your physical and mental integrity. They can put you under forced drugging. And nowadays we see this trend of community-based treatment orders, which is claimed to be an answer to widespread institutionalization, but it's actually a conditional measure. Most often it's that the requirement is that you take the psychiatric medication, and if you do that, you will be allowed in the community. But if you don't take your medication, they have the right to intervene and put you in a locked institution. So it's conditional, and it's totally coercive and controlling. And this is also no form of independent living, while often it is claimed that people with psychosocial disabilities lack the insight and are not able to choose or to understand that they need this kind of support. And it's all used against us. And it's very hard to change the minds, but luckily there are changes coming, like there's more and more attention for recovery, which is a different concept than cure, because the medical model was always thinking about people who need to be cured. Either they want it or not, it doesn't really matter so much, they just had to be made normal. But nowadays there's much more attention for personal growth and your personal journey towards inner peace and well-being. But yeah, the pharmaceutical industry has a significant footprint on the healthcare system. And in the psychiatric sector, that's really a big problem. I can imagine that maybe the pharmaceutical industry is not so much of a pollutive element in regular settings, or in regular medical settings, where when you talk about antibiotics or whatever. But in the psychiatric setting, the medication is really claimed as some kind of savior, while the experiences of people show actually the opposite. And there are studies that point at the fact that people die 20 years sooner due to long-term use of psychiatric medication. So there are a lot of problems that we face as persons with psychosocial disabilities in trying to live independently, like these big institutions, the law, and the pharmaceutical industry. I think those are all part of big barriers. I think that's it for now.
Thank you very much, Jolijn, and thanks for sharing your personal experience with us as well. So we'll talk to you more a bit later. Now, I would like to introduce Mark Wheatley. He will, from the European Union of the Deaf, and he will share with us his thoughts about this initial question. Mark, go ahead, please.
Hello, everybody. Hope you're all well. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me as a presenter in your webinar. Independent living. What does it mean for deaf people? Well, it's accessibility to employment, to education, to decision making. Those are the vital elements. In the deaf community, we are mostly excluded from access to information, a basic thing. Now, during the coronavirus situation, this crisis, this has become even more evident. Information about how to stay safe, other relevant health information around the corona crisis created new barriers and made old barriers more visible. The access to decision making, as we all know in the disability movement, is a basic human right for any person to make your own decisions. And in order to be able to do that is to make decisions based on proper information. If one doesn't have access to information, how can one make decisions? This is our main issue for independent living for people in the deaf community. Now, during the corona crisis, more and more countries are making their press conferences, their public briefings accessible by including a sign language interpreter. This is a welcome development. However, we also see an obligation of wearing masks. How does that enable us to lip read people? How, if it's a legal requirement to have masks, that creates a new barrier for us. And these are issues deaf people are struggling with nowadays. Also, when a deaf person is admitted to a hospital when infected with COVID-19, how can they have access to communication with the health staff, wearing their PPEs, including the masks? This creates a lot of scare. So that as the EUD, we're working very hard. And we're involved in different projects. For example, the SHAPE project, which focuses on accessibility needs for elderly people. And we try to make, to allow elderly people to make their own decisions and to live independently. And thank you very much for your attention for now.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for reflecting on the current issues as well during this pandemic, which I'm sure have affected everyone, but it was good of you to share that. So we will come back to you later as well. Again, and now I would like to introduce our colleague Suvad from Bosnia. Suvad, can you please switch your video on and share with us?
Video now started.
Hello, everybody. My name is Suvad Zahirović, and I'm blind guy for long years ago, till I am born, and I'm one of disability activists in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in a region promoting dignity and rights of persons with disability in many different ways. At the moment, we are in organization and in Bosnia and Herzegovina very focused on mobilization of young people with disability to become more active and to be involved in a disability movement, as well as in independent living movement. For me, independent living means living in dignity, have rights as all other citizens, meaning also to have a right to make my own decisions, to make mistakes as any other person, as well as to get support or services I need to live independently and have a control on those services and possibility to use them when and how I want to use those services for perform independent living. Regarding challenges we are facing performing independent living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I think that I have a right to say as well in the region of the Balkan, there are few main challenges. One is awareness of people with disability about independent living, what it means and how it influences quality of each individual life. Second, most of disabled people organizations also are not aware what independent living means and how they can take actions to provide all necessary things for persons with disability, or to start to advocate for changes persons with disability need to have to perform independent living. Secondly, I must say that authority don't fulfill their obligation regarding full implementation and respect of Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability, and law regulation in our country don't provide not just personal assistance service, but most services important for independent living. That means that we need to work hard and a lot to make changes, and what is really important that we start, and especially young people, youth, are more and more aware about what independent living means for them, and what possibility in living independently provide to everybody who decide to start that journey. And we really believe that more and more people with disability, activists, will start to advocate it and promote independent living. For now, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suvad, for that. You've touched upon some new issues, also awareness among disabled people themselves. Let's move on to our last speaker in this first round, Simone Aspis from the Free Our People campaign in the UK. Simone, would you switch your video on, please, and join us here? We will give Simone a second. Yes, go ahead, Simone, you're on.
Right, am I ready, yeah?
You're ready, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm from the UK. My name's Simone Aspis, and I'm from the Free Our People campaign, which is a campaign to support disabled people get out of these dreadful psychiatric hospitals. I'm a peer advocate working with a couple of disabled people with learning difficulties and autism who are seeking to get out of these awful psychiatric hospitals. So, so the first question I was asked is, what does independent living mean to me? Disabled people have identified in the UK 12 pillars of independent living, which we believe everyone needs to live independently. They are appropriate and accessible information, having an adequate income that enables you to flourish within society, appropriate and accessible in health and social care provisions, a full accessible transport system, full access to the environment, adequate provision of technical and aids and equipment, particularly now as we're moving into the digital age, availability of accessible and adapted housing, adequate provision of personal assistance, availability of inclusive education and training, which you might expect me to say, working at the Alliance for Inclusive Education, equal opportunities for employment, availability of independent advocacy and self-advocacy, availability of peer counselling, and availability of digital inclusion, but I would have added that in as being the 13th pillar. Disabled people cannot enjoy independent living without being able to enjoy the same level of participation in all aspects of life which non-disabled people take for granted. Independent living is not about doing everything by oneself without support. Independent living is about having whatever support one needs to have a flourishing life. I talk about having a flourishing life as opposed to as opposed to surviving, because in the UK, independent living often means just having help in getting dressed in the morning, being able to eat and go to the toilet. We're all familiar with that in the times of austerity. Independent living is about having choice and control over one's life, and therefore decision making is at the core of living independently. Being able to make decisions, make mistakes and learn from the decisions we have made are all part and parcel of independent living. For many disabled individuals with sensory and physical impairments, it can always be assumed they are able to make all decisions for themselves, and therefore nothing is ever explicit. Of course, many people with learning difficulties can make decisions for themselves as well. However, for some people with learning difficulties, they may need support with making decisions. This will involve helping people with learning difficulties explore all the options before making a decision. Similarly, non-disabled people may need support in making decisions, such as choosing the right treatment pathway, making big financial decisions such as investments. What is rarely acknowledged in the independent living movement is that some decisions may also need to be made for some disabled people, i.e. those who may have profound learning difficulties, in order to achieve the independent living outcomes that are enjoyed by their non-disabled peers. For instance, someone with profound learning difficulties may have no concept of money and therefore would not be able to make decisions about spending. In such situations, this and other decisions may need to be made in order to assist some people with learning difficulties live independently. This is no different from acknowledging that disabled individuals may not be able to have full capacity over their body, i.e. never be able to walk or see. Similarly, independent living must not only promote autonomy and control, but also positive well-being. How we feel and how we behave is a reflection of how we feel within ourselves and the barriers we encounter. The social model of disability approach in the UK must be adopted, identifying the attitudinal, organisational and environmental barriers created by society that stops many disabled people from living independently. The biggest challenges we face are as follows. Over the past decade, we have witnessed savage attacks on disabled people's rights to independent living. In the UK, removal of a massive cuts to Independent Living Fund, disabled people's students' allowance, and the special educational needs funding, access to work, various social security benefits have all been justified by government under their austerity programme. Actually, what has happened is that there has been increasing funding of segregated and institutionalisation of disabled people with learning difficulties and autism. Austerity is a myth. We are seeing a government ideological attack on disabled people's rights, full stop. And we are seeing a complete and utter hostile environment created by this government. Now, the coronavirus pandemic and the law has exposed how fragile our rights are. The Corona Act has permitted the following in broad terms: the suspension of disabled people's care packages and education and healthcare provision. Social distancing has meant withdrawal of care packages, having less priority for COVID-19 testing and treatment. No contact with the outside world if one is living in an institution. No regulatory inspections of institutional and care settings. Majority of people dying from COVID-19 are disabled themselves, and they are taking place within institutionalized settings. The government's telling many people with learning difficulties they must shield themselves from the outside world. Do not leave your front door or let anyone in one's home to provide support. This has led to many people feeling more anxious about living independently after lockdown. It has also led to many impersonal services using COVID-19 not to provide personal assistance and support to enable people with learning difficulties to live independently. The government, again, has made an ideological choice. With all the money created, there could have been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use that money to invest in a fantastic national independent living service, particularly when there is greater risk of dying from COVID-19 stuck in institutionalized settings than within one's home with appropriate levels of assistance. It is very clear from the UK, this government have a total and utterly disregard for disabled people's human rights underneath the UNCRPD. The government were found wanting in the UK, the UK government are the first country to be found in total breach of disabled people's human rights underneath the UNCRPD. Under the UNCRPD. So the other big issue that I think we face in the UK is actually parents and professionals see the campaign on the ending of institutionalisation as being their campaign. And the challenge that we have as disabled people with learning difficulties is what role do we play in regards to taking that leadership forward. At the end of the day, our struggle for independent living has always started from the leadership of disabled people with support from allies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone, for that. Yeah, you've raised some new issues as well here. So the austerity or the myth of austerity. So we are at the end of our first round here. Where all the speakers have shared their comments on independent living and the current challenges. I think what everybody had very much in common was different ways of social exclusion for different reasons, but which all have the same effect on people not being able to participate, access information, get healthcare treatment during COVID. etc., being left out from education, housing, etc. So just a tiny bit of a summary of these initial comments, although it's quite difficult to summarize them because we've heard quite a lot from all our speakers. So I would like to move to the next round now. We are running slightly bit over time at this moment. So hopefully we can have a bit of time for discussion at the end as well. So I will ask different questions now to different speakers. Simone, I will switch your video off, or I will ask you to stop video. Yes, so we can go back to Magnus and Cecilia in Sweden. Magnus and Cecilia, you can switch your video on now, please. Yes. So the question, just as a way of tiny bit of introduction, we, at least at ENIL, often get the argument that for some people independent living isn't possible. People who are in Magnus's situation are most often in institutions in different countries around Europe, in most countries. So just to understand from you and Magnus, what sort of support services would you say are sort of key for making sure that everyone can live independently in the community with, for example, the level of support needs that Magnus has, and also in terms of using personal assistance, even among disabled people, some people think that people in Magnus's situation cannot access cannot use personal assistance. So just if you can explain to our audience a little bit about that. Go ahead.
Thank you. So let's start about explaining a little about how your assistance works, Magnus, in practical life, because you have about 7 personal assistants on a working time schedule, and some of them have the skills to assist you during nights, because then you are using technical aids to breathe. And some of the assistants have the skills to assist you during daytime when you are an active person and need their help in many situations and settings. And maybe the most important thing during daytime, to be able to communicate with others. And some of the assistants can do both, of course. So, and then you also have some extra assistants who, most of them actually used to work with you before, and they can substitute for the regular ones when they cannot work as planned. And upon that, you have chosen 1 or 2 persons to be the assistant's supervisor. And during many years, it was our mother, and she is still something of the master of interpretation when it comes to your wishes and needs. She guides the assistants in many everyday situations, but she's not a personal assistant anymore. Nowadays, you also have some assistants with extra responsibilities. Some have the responsibility to find a substitute when suddenly needed, to pick up the phone and call these extra assistants, or someone else to jump in when someone gets ill. The administration of the assistants, the kind of local administration, making up the time schedule and things like that, it's also handed over to 2 of the assistants. But the important thing is to remember that the supervision of the assistants has to be done in a personalized way, the way that you, Magnus, should have done it if you could. So it cannot be done in a standardized way by someone in an office who doesn't know your wishes and needs and who cannot communicate with you. That's the most important thing. Then it's not personal assistance, then it's just assistance. You also need to introduce new assistants very carefully. First, they need to go beside an experienced assistant during several weeks to get to know you and understand how you communicate. First, they just look and listen. And then they have to try, of course, to give you assistance, but under supervision. And finally, they have to prove that they have the necessary skills before they can assist you themselves on their own, together with only you. And secondly, they need some theoretical formation about things that are important to you, Magnus. Like what is a brain injury, what is epilepsy, how do you act after a seizure if you get one, about movement training, alternative communication, things like that. But they are still beginners, and very often they say that after a year or two as assistants to you, Magnus, they start to realize that it took at least half a year or maybe more to really understand you and to be able to do a good work. And the second perspective, the things that we also meet that you mentioned, Ines, about the institutions, that people with large impairments cannot live independently and have to live in institutions. We met this many times, of course, in different situations, but not as much in Sweden nowadays as before, but in other countries in Europe and worldwide. It's not true, of course. There's no reason at all that someone should have to live in an institution. It's not true. It's a fact that you, Magnus, you cannot be left alone, not for a minute. And that would be the case if you lived in an institution as well. So there is no difference in your needs. There's no practical or organizational differences for the society, actually. It's not more difficult for you to live alone because you need support 24/7 anyway. So it kind of comes down to the level of ambition. The question is, do society want to give you and your friends the option to live a free life, live like others, included in the society? Or do the society only want to store you away, use economies of scale to do it as cheap as possible? And I think there are many answers to this question in the UN Convention. To say that someone has to live in an institution is violating the convention, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia and Magnus. Can you stay just 1 second with us? I think, yeah, you raised many important points. I just wanted, because we are getting questions already, so I thought I would keep you for 1 more second. Could you reflect a little bit about the point on supported decision making? And in Magnus's case, would you, as his family, people who know him, then exercise this role, also in terms of hiring personal assistants, but also making other important decisions in life? Or is there another system, that is sort of set up for that?
Yeah, there is a system, a separate system set up for supported decision making. So I have not, it's not a question, it's not within the assistance that I help you, Magnus. Both me and your mother are still legal representatives, and we are appointed by court in Sweden to have this role. And we help you with decisions, of course, regarding your personal assistance, but also other things like regarding where you want to live, or where you want to go on vacation, or different decisions in life. And of course, the assistants help you, Magnus, with like small decisions, what to eat to dinner and things like that. But it relies on the fact that they need to know you, and the interpretation is always like the last word of the interpretation of your wishes and wills wishes and needs, Magnus, is made by your mother and sometimes me. So the assistants, if they are kind of don't know, do Magnus like this? If they are new, they ask us, of course, how do Magnus want his assistance? And then we give some limits, like you can maneuver it within these frames.
Right. Thank you both. So that's very helpful. I think people are really interested in how that works, because it doesn't work well or at all in other countries. So thank you for that. Just in the interest of time, we'll move on, but we might get back to you later if we have time. And just to encourage everyone to keep putting questions into the chat box or the Q&A box. And I believe you also have access to that. So feel free to have a look. So thank you. We will move on to Thibault again in France. Yes, Thibault, so you already talked a little bit about people with autism or autistic people, I don't know what term you prefer, and about people who communicate in different ways and how they're more excluded certain circumstances. So can you just tell us a bit more? Obviously, people with autism, autistic people are again one of the groups who is really affected by institutionalization and people termed as having challenging behavior, or just too difficult to sort of cope with, to live in the community. We see a lot of that. So maybe if you can reflect a little bit on, what is needed, what do you think is crucial for everyone, people with in the sort of autistic community to live in the community. Also, is personal assistance at all relevant to maybe not to you personally, but to other people yes, please go ahead.
So most autistic people don't enjoy the right to independent living in France, but there are different issues. Autism is a spectrum, and so there are different assessments and different level of support. There are social and communication issues, and we prefer sameness and specific interests. And so it's a complex disability. It's not negative, but just sometimes we have sensory issues, and we don't understand our own feelings. We don't know always our own body, and we need to learn about us and between us at first. And there is also several and different disabilities that can be associated with autism: intellectual disability, language impairment, other development disability, or psychosocial disabilities. So assessments will be different for that, and we need to distinguish all these conditions to get the assessments. And often caretaker in institutions, doctor, don't understand and say that is a problem of autism. Situation in France is particular because we have also issues with the views and the care of autism. It's not adapted, it's not fit, it's not adapted for autistic people, and sometimes it's really outdated views. So autistic people are faced with many barriers, such as knowledge about autism. I think it's a good point. The misunderstanding of their needs, society without accommodation, obviously, but politics promote autonomy also, but ablaze autonomy. For instance, most of treatments for autism are based on the modification of behavior. So it's a rehabilitation model. Caretaker and parents want that autistic people become independent, but as non-disabled people. And that's why I think it's considered as between intellectual disability and mental disease, because there is no cure, but the parents want to improve autism. So it's in between. And civil rights are unknown for autistic peoples, and I think that it's common in Europe. This front also they are perceived as the lack of skills. Professional doctors think they have not skills, so we can remove the legal capacity. And so the third challenge is a conceptualization of autism and its understanding to get the good needs, access needs, and reduce troubles. So, for instance, many troubles such as challenging behavior are caused by this lack of understanding. Often, sensory issues are well taken in account in institutions. And but I think only autistic people can talk or type about that. And the second challenge is to access to independent living, but to design community service and communication tools to support most of autistic people in community. And many autistic people in a situation anyway have bad support or without support. And I think, for instance, personal assistance is not designed for autistic people, but I think there are many reasons that can justify personal assistance. For instance, we have different needs, but we have in common sameness, specific interests, need of a schedule, and these needs can be supported by personal assistance because, for instance, if one of the people, one of the guy has complex needs, for instance, he wants to go out to his favorite cafe, he will be faced with much distress in the streets, in the environment. So often it's the noise, it's a weird guy, it's cars, many factors. And so social model of disability, I think it's not about accommodation in the environment, but it's on personal assistance because we cannot remove, of course, all that in the streets, but a personal assistant is a human close to us, and we can interact with him, and it can be more safer, and adapted. And also, autistic people learn better one-to-one, one interaction with one people. And so I think it will be a good support for autistic people. But the challenge is that parents they prefer to modify the behavior in order to be independent, but I think it doesn't work. It's not really a solution. And also, they also the way politics way, because actually we have not more 10 hours of support, so it's not really accessible for no speaking autistic people, and we have not communication tools anyway. So there is a personal assistance and also communication tools that we can develop to know the access needs of more autistic people and the ways to ensure independent living. And after, in the end, of course, the work also, it's to get job is also an issue and challenge because most of autistic people, I think, have no job, but they can work for them mostly. So it's also a challenge. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Thibault. There's quite a few parallels with what Jolijn was sharing as well, with sort of the role of the so-called treatment or trying to cure a condition. And I think that is, it's interesting also the diversity of experiences. When we talk about independent living or personal assistance, there is often, even among disabled people's organizations, the view that it can just work one way for everyone. And it's so important to consider, people's diverse experiences. So which is why it's great to have you here as well, and everyone else. So thank you, Thibault. We'll move. We have quite a few questions. I would encourage the speakers to look through the Q&A box if you can as well. So if you can answer some question directly, please go ahead. But for now, we'll move to Kristina again. Kristina, will you switch your video on, please? So the question for Kristina is, what, are you here with us? Yes, you are here. You mentioned the situation in Lithuania initially, and also institutions and group homes. You mentioned that you are yourself benefiting from a pilot PA project, which may or may not be continued or turned into legislation. What would you, you know, what kind of services or support services, good practices would you say from your experience you would, let's say, you would recommend to the Lithuanian government to, you know, to develop in order to improve the situation of disabled people? Go ahead, Kristina. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Yeah.
So at first I wanted to say that the best experience is when you can see the reality of independent living yourself, and later the best way is to share it everywhere where you can to do it. As for example, before 4 years I was in Sweden, and I had internship, and I got more knowledge about what independent living and person's assistant really is, because I visited some cities, cooperatives, communicated with disabled people and their assistants. Later, when I came back to Lithuania, so I brought this whole experience and talk about it in many conferences again and again. So finally, our Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor created a work group where we created documents for the pilot project. So the second pilot project is running now, and I have personal assistant myself. I can choose where I need the help, when I need the help, and how I need to do it. Of course, I teach my personal assistant what she should do and what not. Just as I was mentioned before, that now we should fight for that law, because now it is just a pilot project, so that all disabled people should be included, and they could have the right to choose how they want to live. And of course that our government should give enough finance for it, because I think it is a difficult question in all countries. So we now make proposals for that act of social integration, where personal assistant is included, and we hope that the government will take a good decision for it, for these changes. And it will, if everything okay, so it will be entered into force next year. So if it happens, so I think later will be more easy to affect all other process of the institutionalization. It's a very difficult word. So I think later will be better also to change our group homes so that now can't be stopped in any way.
Sorry, now I forgot. Thank you very much, Kristina, for sharing that. And I think you've done a great job in Lithuania, even getting this pilot started, of course. Hopefully you can, you can continue, like you say, with the rest. So thanks for that. We'll move on. We might come back to you later if there is a question. So we'll go back to Jolijn. She shared with us some thoughts already. Jolijn, do you want to come on? Yes, again. So now, I guess you've received your questions already, but just maybe to reformulate a little bit so it's understandable for everyone. We obviously we already identified lots of people are forced to live in institutions or just forced to receive treatment. You mentioned that. Lots of people are still under guardianship across Europe. So how can we, the question is, how can we advocate better against that for independent living, to make sure that people can make decisions about their lives that they want to make. You know, given that we don't have supported decision making in a lot of countries, you know, how can we overcome that? And finally, would you say that personal assistance is relevant to people with psychosocial disabilities at all? So go ahead.
Well, I think the first problem is, again, the deprivation of legal capacity, because it's widespread in the community that there's this stigma and fear for persons with psychosocial disabilities. Also the media, they promote all these stereotypes of people being so-called a danger to themselves or others. They're violent, unreliable, etc., unpredictable. So there's a lot of fear usually. And then the law allows for forced interventions. And I think one of the biggest problems is that the law is usually based on the incapacity approach, which means that they find you have a deficiency or a defect, or you're not perfect, basically. And based on that assessment, they suddenly take over. And this has nothing to do with whether it is in line with your wishes or not. They just say you're sick and you need to be cured. And so when a person says no, because they don't like that particular offer of that particular treatment, which is usually confinement in a psychiatric hospital and forced medication, there is no other option available. So then society, or like the laws, they allow as a last resort, because there are no first resorts. So as a last resort, it's allowed to put people in the hospital, but it's all based on their status. By having a diagnosis, therefore you go to the hospital, or based on the functional assessment, saying you cannot perform this or that, so therefore you are unable to live in the community. And then they put you in a group home or a setting, or under guardianship, under community treatment order. But it's not based on the wishes and the will of the person. It's really the opposite of the CRPD. It's the incapacity approach, or you take what is in line with the person's wishes. And this is a big change that is actually starting in the mental health care sector. Because in the past it was all medical model, but nowadays we see more and more initiatives which are based on empowerment and recovery. And they are thinking about what would help, instead of only saying these are safety measures, because a lot of the forced treatments in psychiatric hospitals, they are not even designed as treatment. They are considered safety measures. So it has nothing to do with the will and preferences of the person. It's actually a measure to supposedly protect society from dangerous people who are confused. And that is not healthcare. And I think there's so much stigma and stereotyping that is enforced by the media and that is enforced in legislation and in practice, that it's so widespread and for such a long time throughout the history of Europe. Because we all know the dark history of what happened in the past in the psychiatric hospitals, and the people who were all killed, all the disabled people who were killed. I think this is we don't have much experience with including people in the community in Europe. And that's, I think, one of the barriers that makes it so hard, because we just lack the good practices. They have not been around. And then pharmaceutical industry once more tries to maintain the medical model approach and this incapacity approach because they make a lot of profit from it. But luckily there's more and more protests and awareness on what is actual well-being, and it's not the absence of any unwanted behavior, but it's really about the intrinsic experience of well-being and mental health. And I think this awareness of what is mental health, what are we talking about? We are not talking about dangerous psychopaths, because that seems to be the prevailing image if people talk about persons with psychosocial disabilities. And it gives an image of fear. But why should people fear persons who have like a history of trauma? And there are so many studies that show that persons with psychosocial disabilities are 5 to 10 times more often the victim of a crime than the perpetrator of a crime. Yet the stigma is so big that in basically every country in Europe, people, once they are diagnosed with a more severe psychiatric diagnosis, they are automatically assumed to be dangerous and need to be protected for their own best interest. And there's very few experiences with personal assistance, although I think people do find their own way in finding their comfort and well-being. Let me check. Yeah, of course, there's the forced treatment. It actually implies that the person says no to the offer that has been made to a certain treatment. But because it's considered as a safety measure, they will proceed anyway, even if you say no. But when a person says no, it means they don't want that particular offer. Maybe they would want something else, but that something else is not available. So when you are in a psychosis, usually the default reaction would be to give person medication, either voluntary or involuntary. And it's only very new that in Norway, they have been starting a pilot with medication-free wards, because people have the right to choose. And if you don't want medication, there should be also an option to live without medication. It's a basic human right to choose if you want that particular treatment or not. But the right to say no in psychiatry is really hard, and it's very closely linked to the lack of alternatives. There's like only one stream of so-called treatment, and that's all based on incapacity. And I think if we start looking at the wishes and the needs as identified by the person themselves, and we start thinking about empowerment and recovery and increasing the person's own capacity and independence, I think it's much more beneficial for well-being. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that the recovery approach, as how it's called, is much more successful than all those forced treatments. So I guess there's a lot of awareness to raise. I think that's it.
Thanks so much, Jolijn, and there's people thanking you for your presentation as well. We can see in the chat. Yeah, it's good to hear that things are moving positively towards the recovery approach, which I'm sure is thanks to your work as well. I think, yeah, the point you made also about kind of something being used for the as the last resort, but it's the only, it's the first resort as well. That's something in common with a lot of disabled people is sort of what are the options. There's often only one option or two bad options. So I think that is something in common to everyone. But it's thanks so much for that. And again, we might come back to if we don't run out of time completely. We will move on to Suvad now. Suvad, please rejoin us again. Hi, Suvad. So the question for Suvad is, I mean, sometimes there is a view that for blind people, as you said, you are from birth, that it's enough to put in, some tactile paths to give people guide dogs or etc., and that is enough, for them to be independent, to live independently. What would you say to that? And also, again, do you consider personal assistance as being of use or important for people who are blind or visually impaired?
Yeah, first of all, I must say that personal assistant for the blind is something very, very important, and provide or raise quality of life. And there is no alternative for personal assistant service, although blind people have a possibility to choose many technological innovation or products which make our independent living or everyday life easier, much easier than before, probably 10-15 years. And what I can say that really there are conditions which need to be fulfilled in society to make life for blind, everyday life, much easier. Those are architectural barriers, those are awareness of people, those are skills blind people need to have to use all possibility they have for independent living. But all those cannot replace personal assistant. What is a challenge? What is the issue on which blind people can't often give a proper answer is for what I as a blind can use a personal assistant. Often not just blind, but other disabled people who might need personal assistant are not aware of all needs for which fulfillment they can use personal assistant as support. And then rather they say, I don't need personal assistant, then rather than start to think what are the needs for which fulfillment I can use personal assistant. I can say for me, myself, I try almost everything available as a supportive technologies or I don't know, other things for blind to live independently. Like, for example, guide dog, which is not common in Bosnia. Like, for example, moving independently using white cane, using new navigation technologies, etc., etc. But still, there are things you can only get with support of personal assistant. Like, for example, during the job performance, everyday work, I need personal assistant to check either my documents are formatted well, or to explain or support me how to use Zoom, etc., or to help me to fulfill some documents, etc., etc. There are many different things personal assistant can help blind person. I just mentioned, I just remind myself on a pilot project which was implemented by Association of Blind in Sarajevo, providing personal assistance service for blind women, and amazing changes were made during the period of using personal assistant. But through the project, those women are taught what personal assistant means, in which way they can use it, for which purposes, etc., etc., and how to manage personal assistant as well, because we are as employers of personal assistant, and really need to learn to have a skills how to manage personal assistant. Having in mind all these requirements, I'm sure that personal assistant as a service can really change life of everyone who is living with disability, and that's one of basic rights of us as a disabled, and we need to fight for it really hardly, because it's provide us many things, and at the beginning, at the end, dignity with which we have a right to live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suvad. And again, we might come back to you later. I will just move on. So we do have quite a few questions in our Q&A box. So I will move to Mark, and a similar question for Mark. Basically, yes, again, the deaf community is not always a part of or considered a part of the independent living movement, or not so well represented. So what are some of the issues that you are working on, for example, as the European Union of the Deaf? You mentioned some issues in your initial presentation, but in terms of support services or or adjustments or anything in society to make sure that deaf people can live independently or have the right to independent living, what would those be? Again, the role of personal assistance as well, if you can reflect on that. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. Thank you. I think deaf people within the deaf community is kind of an invisible community.
Disability.
On the invisible disability. On the issue of personal assistance versus sign language interpretation, an interpreter translates from one language to another, like spoken language interpreters do, for example, from Swedish to English, or vice versa. So in that sense, sign language interpreters should be seen as translators, interpreters. That role is very clear. But communication here is key. Very often, deaf people are left out of communication, especially in education. Historically, a lot of education of deaf children focused on teaching deaf children of how to speak and lip read in order to and as a tool to integrate in society. It's like putting a ball in a square peg. It doesn't fit. So many deaf people were forced to so-called integrate through speech and lip reading. Of course, this historical focus on integration through speech and speech reading led to the reality that many deaf people out there have poor reading and writing skills. And for that, many deaf people need support in how to write documents, how to convey their understanding of their rights. Now that we see an increased level of recognition of sign language, that's a positive trend, but a long-term aim is to improve the quality of education. The independent living movement, I think, is more focused on physical access, a support in mobility. I'm not saying this is true or this is right, but for many deaf people out there, they do need support in their daily lives, for communication, for assistance in finding employment or in employment, to mention just a few issues. I think there is growing awareness of the need to cooperate with the disability movement. As the EUD, for example, we have very close working relationships and good working relationships with the Independent Network of Independent Living. We are supporting the Freedom March. I think this is not the time to exclude each other within the disability movement. When we become separated as a movement, we become weaker. So we need to be one movement and not looking at what impairments divide us, but we have to focus on what we share. And we're a human rights advocacy movement. That makes sense to each and every one of us. I'm looking forward to asking more questions and contributing to the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. And as Mark said, we do work together with the European Union of the Deaf, and it would be good to see better links also at the national levels among the disability community. And I think sort of events like this, whether they're webinars or just talking to each other more, and obviously in ways so that everybody can participate. So in terms of access for all are very important. So it is very good to have you here today. So thank you, Mark. And we will move to Simone, who is our last speaker in this round before we get to questions. Simone, so please join us again. And the question for you, I will just wait for Simone to join. Simone, can you switch your video on again?
I'm trying. I can't. I don't know what's going on. Okay, got too many.
We can hear you. We can hear you. So let's try.
Okay, I don't know why I don't know why it's not working. Hello?
Yeah, but we can hear you. Let me see if this
it's too many clicking around and I get, okay. Can we just...
Okay, don't worry, Simone. Let's start because we can hear you and the interpreter can hear you. So the question for you, you've mentioned already about working with people in institutions, and you've mentioned austerity. You've mentioned a lot of issues in the UK. Why do you think the situation is getting worse? Why are so many people with intellectual or learning difficulties sent to these assessment and treatment units, other types of institutions? What are the problems basically? Go ahead.
Okay, so typically government's approach to dealing with disability is a medical model one. Many other funded services, such as segregated services, education, health and social care facilities, focuses on normalizing disabled people with learning difficulties through extended therapy programs and independent living training. Big emphasis is on applied behaviour analysis, positive behaviour support, which focuses on trying to make disabled people conform to culturally appropriate behaviour and ways of being. With pressure on mainstream education institutions becoming more like examination factories, increasing number of disabled children have been squeezed out of mainstream education. There has been a steady rise in disabled children being placed in segregated and institutionalized settings. Increasingly, numbers of disabled children are now being educated in special schools, out of borough, special school placements, and residential special schools, hundreds of miles away from family, friends, and their neighbourhood. Many of these young disabled people will find that segregated education placements are just one step from moving into a psychiatric hospital. This is because of the failure to see that actually it's not disabled people that need to change, but the approach by non-disabled practitioners. The problem we have in the UK is that personal assistance has essentially asked, personal assistance has been the central ask by the independent living campaign run by disabled people, over the majority of them having physical impairments. Of course, disabled people with learning difficulties having personal assistance support independent living in the community is important. However, there must be purposeful activities that disabled people with learning difficulties can take part in where meaningful relationships are created and maintained. Having all the personal assistance you like is meaningless if educational, employment, leisure, social and political activities are not welcoming of disabled people. Too often, disabled people with learning difficulties are placed in areas with high levels of deprivation, criminal and antisocial behaviour. In the UK, there are stronger laws to lock disabled people with learning difficulties up in hospitals than arrange for support required to live a fulfilled life in the community near families and friends. Under the UK mental health law, people with learning difficulties and autism can be locked up in psychiatric institutions without a mental health disorder. In brackets, don't think I support psychiatric hospitals for anybody, even with a mental health disorder. Quote, of course. There is no requirement in the UK law to arrange for support that disabled people with learning difficulties require in order to flourish in the community. Too often, it's the failure of local authorities to arrange educational, health and care support that many disabled individuals need to have a good quality life. Local and health authorities will often deny individuals access to diagnosis, assessments, and when they have a diagnosis, the support is often not arranged. There is too much buck passing. Local authorities are in no rush to provide any form of community care and therefore quite happily allow individuals to deteriorate in their locally. Similarly, local health authorities called clinical commissioning groups are equally reluctant to pay for any health-related services. So where the bill is picked up by the National Health Service England, no one wants to take responsibility. So therefore, it is in a nutshell, we are at a crossroads where people with learning difficulties and autism, it's all seen as a medical condition that can be treated by psychotic drugs, through rehabilitation programs, through, and that feels to me that's where we're going. And as more and more young people are entering in segregated education, that will actually mean there will be a drive towards much more institutionalisation. It is no accident in the UK that over the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen the doubling of disabled children under 18 ending up in the psychiatric system, whilst at the same time seeing more and more disabled children moving from mainstream education into special schools, into particularly residential institutions. And therefore, what we're actually seeing more and more is how the system at the moment is moving much more to segregation of disabled people. And you can't ignore the detrimental impact that has upon disabled people's mental well-being, their sense of who they are, their identity, feeling part of the part of their community, and therefore there needs to be a completely redress if we really are now wanting to move towards deinstitutionalization. You absolutely need to start from the premise of that disabled people's right to independent living must begin in terms of disabled people's right to inclusive education. And when we talk about inclusive education, of course we are talking about the inclusion of deaf culture, the inclusion of BSL interpretation. We are talking about all disabled people who identify themselves as being disabled themselves.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simone. Thanks so much for that. I think really there's a cross-cutting theme here, attempts to sort of cure people so that way they integrate better in society rather than seeing people for who they are and providing them with, you know, the support to sort of, to live their lives without having to be changed in some way. So we have to finish on time because we have our interpreters here and our captioners, so we have to behave. So I would like to go to a couple of questions. If I can ask Magnus and Cecilia to come on, I will. There were a couple of questions for you. I will join them. The first question is, and you can reply together.
Sorry, Ines, could you take some other questions first, because Magnus had to leave me for a couple of minutes, so I just wait for him to come back. Sorry.
No problem. So I will start. Just I will leave you for the end. Then let's go to Thibault. There is a question for Thibault here. Let me just find it now. I'm sorry, I just lost it now. Sorry about that. I had it, but maybe I will, because there were some questions for more speakers. If you can reflect a bit, Thibault, on the issue of Simone mentioned that some people might need decisions being made for them, and the issue of supported decision making. What would be your position about that, on that issue? Yes, go ahead.
You mean how to do the decision making?
Yes, because Simone said that some people might need some decisions to be made for them in case they cannot make decisions, financial decisions, or whatever other major life decisions. So what would be your opinion about that, or your position on that?
I think often autistic people have we think that they have a lack of skills, so I think we need to suppose that autistic people can take decisions at first, but and also I think for the most of autistic people, we need more attitudes, change the attitudes, more understand the communications, and so we can understand the needs and the decisions. And personal assistance, I think it's a good way, because we can take decisions and discuss about these decisions. And in the most of cases, I think we need to practice doubt, because it was interesting for Magnus, because we have different forms, different interpretations. So I think it's better to use doubt and not take a decisions if we have a doubt about the thinking or other things. It's because it's better to adopt than remove the capacity and legal capacity.
Thank you, Thibault, for that. And I did see you answer the other question in writing. So thanks for that. Let me give the floor to Jolijn. We have a question from Mari here. She is asking, I would love to hear more about the alternative and community-based support for people who have psychosis or schizophrenia or some other more severe diagnosis in whatever they're called. What kind of support should be there instead of forced hospitalization and medication if the person does not want medication or to be hospitalized? Yes, and whether if you have any references for any further reading, obviously you can share those with us later as well. Thank you, Jolijn.
Yeah, I think it all starts with the awareness that every reaction has a reason. Everything has a cause. If a person is upset, it has a reason. It's not just coming out of the sky, out of the blue. And so it's not a medical, biochemical imbalance that just suddenly happens. At least most people don't believe that it's like a medical thing. And it's a social thing. And so therefore a social approach is also needed, because psychosocial problems, you could see them mostly as social problems of barriers in the interaction. So then you automatically, it comes down to social approaches. So open dialogue is one of those famous ways of alternative handling of persons in a crisis, by actually listening to what the person has to say. And even while in the beginning it may sound confused, but there is a reason why people get so confused and upset, because they have been dealing with a lot of things that came on their path at the same time. So they may get upset and get lost. But the solution is then not to medicate, but to really figure out what is going on. And often there's a lot of taboo involved. People feel misunderstood or very lonely or very ashamed or scared. So there's a lot of ways to deal with that. There's also this initiative called Soteria houses. There are runaway houses which are run by peers. So that is other people who have experience with mental health issues. And yeah, it's mostly the social approaches. There's family group conferencing. I will send you a short paragraph which mentions a number of these alternatives. I hope this answers the question.
I think so. Jolijn, thank you very much. And Simone just adds in the chat box, this is why I talked about promoting positive well-being as core of independent living, i.e. to reduce self-harm, helping people to problem solve. And she says, certainly from the Free Our People advocacy, when I asked about their ideas of independent living, no one ever talks about independent living.
No. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Simone.
No, I meant, sorry. No one talks about positive well-being.
Okay.
Yeah. I probably, because that's something that I always ask when I ask providers, what's your understanding of independent living? And nobody ever talks about well-being. Everybody talks about behaviour, like the psychiatric hospital. You know, everybody focuses on behaviour, on people's behaviour, people taking part in activities, but no one has ever said to me so far, actually, our central role is to promote someone's positive well-being that will enable them to flourish in the community. And that to me feels quite shocking, because a lot of people end up in the psychiatric system is because they have had a negative sense of well-being because of the way society treats them, the way, the fact they've had very poor care. You can see the drivers towards why people end up in the psychiatric system. But it seems to me the psychiatric system, again, and the independent and services just don't see their role as being centrally about positive well-being.
Thanks so much, Simone. And maybe we should have another webinar on the role of well-being in independent living. It
has to be made, because that's, to me, if you ask me the one thing that's particularly missing, when I saw people with, this is why I think there is a real issue in the UK movement. It's people with physical and sensory impairments. I think that I can't remember the deaf guy, but he touched on it, where it's all about, and those things can be assumed. People with physical and sensory impairments don't need support with their well-being. They need, they just need people to help them, be their hands and arms, their arms and legs. But when you are dealing with people with learning difficulties and people with mental health conditions, people with autism, then you are in a situation where you are having to facilitate people's well-being as well as facilitating their engagement in society.
Thanks very much for that, Simone. I will move to, just because we have to close, I will give the floor finally to Magnus and Cecilia. You'll have to be very brief in answering the question. It's basically, how did Magnus start using personal assistance, or how did he hear about independent living? So if you can do it briefly. And the other question was about making mistakes, whether you have any fears about personal assistance, making mistakes, and basically the risks involved. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The question about risks and mistakes, I think I answered it in the chat. So, and the question on how you found personal assistance, how everything started, is a very long story, of course, but in very brief, Magnus tried different kinds of support during his life, and many kinds of support that in the beginning that didn't work. He lived in a group home for about 9 months, and had other kinds of home services for a very, very limited amount, where your relatives made gave you most of the support anyway. So, and finally, the municipality said, they admitted that, okay, we are not going to make this in a good way. So here, you get the money, do it yourself, see if you can succeed. Yeah. So that's how it started. That was before personal assistance was a legal right in Sweden. It took some years from then. And then we had a legislation that is today as well in Sweden that gives people the right to personal assistance. So Magnus was a pioneer, and he was also leading the fight in Sweden for personal assistance, not just for people who could supervise themselves, but for everyone.
Thanks so much to both of you for joining. I think it's a good note to end this webinar on as well. I apologize if we haven't answered somebody's question. We will try to follow this webinar up with some more webinars based on the discussion today, the comments received. We will share the recording. We will also, because we do get a copy of the chat box, don't worry if you haven't had time to copy anything, we can share that with you, because I see that Jolijn provided some very useful information here, and there might be other things. I
can just say, from the UK, implementation of UNCRPD, monitoring committees, observations and recommendations around supporting independent living, inclusive education, and repealing legislation around compulsory treatment of disabled people. So have a look on the ALFI website, or a recommendation. So that would have been my answer to the first question.
Thank you, Simone, for that. Let's close on that. Thank you again to everyone, to all the speakers who gave up their time to join us today and share their personal experiences and insights. Thank you very much for to our interpreters as well, and to our captioners. Yes, let's continue this discussion. Let's continue learning from each other, seeing how we can advocate better together for independent living. Thank you also to my colleagues, Camille and Laura, who actually prepared everything for this webinar. Yes, have a good rest of the day, thank you and goodbye to all. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye. It was nice meeting you all.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
And enjoying the session. With you guys. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. I will end this now. Bye-bye.
Bye.